warm welcome to Africa 360, where the current affairs show that unpacks issues of continental significance that matter to you. If it's about Africa, we'll be bringing it to you here. I'm Chris Maraleng, and this is Africa 360. In this week's edition, it's been 100 years since South Africa introduced the Natives Land Act, a damning piece of apartheid legislation that first paved the way for major inequalities in the agricultural sector. But the policy was dismantled in 1994 with the advent of democracy. This week on Africa 360, we look at the plight of small-scale farmers in Africa's economic powerhouse. All this and more coming up right here on Africa 360. Less than 5% of South Africa's labor force is employed in agriculture. That's despite the country's long history of farming, while the rest of sub-Saharan Africa is dominated by subsistence agriculture. South Africa's small-scale farming class no longer seems to exist. So, what happened? Let's take a look.
Sub-Saharan Africa, one great collective nation of farmers, the majority of whom are subsistence farmers, smallholders, peasant farmers. But there's an exception. Unlike its northern neighbours, South Africa's agriculture industry is almost exclusively commercial. 36,000 land-owning, predominantly white farmers employ around 500,000 black workers on 40% of the land, and 2.3 million small-scale farmers make up the rest. Together, that's just 5% of the country's population, facing one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. Agriculture's contribution to gross domestic product has slipped from 10.3% in 1967 to 2.5%, and 600,000 jobs have been lost over the last decade. And while the value of agricultural exports has almost tripled as commercial farmers doubled their net income, this increasingly small group of elite agriculturalists has become responsible for providing 95% of South Africa's local produce. Meanwhile, the vast majority depends almost solely on the government, with no means of improving their quality of life. 16.6 million people are receiving social grants, 15 million live on less than $100 a month, and more than 3 million South Africans have inadequate access to food. But this wasn't always the case. Farming has been a culture in South Africa since as far back as 300 AD. For hundreds of years, the pastoral Khoi, the Bantu-speaking agriculturalists, the European settlers, all grew and produced enough to feed their families and communities and sell the rest at market. But division and inequality soon drew deep lines in the soil. Boers and British fought for sovereignty, and black communities were segregated and controlled. On June 19, 1913, the Natives Land Act came into law. Black people, 80% of the population, were excluded from buying, hiring or farming on 93% of the land. They were forced into reserves, dubbed the homelands. These lands weren't particularly fertile. Blacks were prohibited from sharecropping. Chiefs were given total ownership and power, and the population density averaged 30 people per square kilometre. A cornerstone of apartheid until the 1990s, the Natives Land Act was one of the most damaging pieces of legislation in South African history. And with so few small-scale farmers now producing food, almost all of whom still live on 7% of the land, and 30% of whom don't earn any income at all from agriculture, its legacy continues to this day.
More than 2 million South Africans are trying to make a go at farming. Many of them are growing barely enough to get by, though. Some have had more successes. Either way, the challenges they face as a collective are indeed vast, from land reform issues to a lack of government support and indeed access to finances. One dynamic subsistence farmer who has defied all those odds to scoop a national award is Kinalemang Khoreadira. She's following in the footsteps of her forefathers, having left Johannesburg to go to her rural home in Rustenburg to redefine truly African agriculture.
An award-winning subsistence farmer, determined to one day enter South Africa's commercial agriculture sector. Kinalimang Koreadira, fondly known as Mama Kina, and her husband Tommy started Tojani Organic Farm in Phokeng, northwest in 2009, with the vision of rediscovering the practices of her forefathers.
I used to go and till the land because that's where we got food. Our grandmothers and our mothers used to pay school fees with a basket of eggs, and that means farming was very important to them. Because the history of this country, because of migrant labor, our parents, our fathers were pushed to Johannesburg and all over to come and work, and the women remained, in the rural areas, and they tilled the land, and they raised their children. They tended to the cattle, to the sheep, to the goats, to the chickens. They kept the home fires burning. How many people in South Africa do agriculture? You get people from Zimbabwe, from Malawi, from all over that really value agriculture. But our children will be doctors, will be lawyers, will be teachers. That's the only thing we knew. We're never socialized to say we can be a self-determining nation. Apartheid brought us there. And I thought it is time for me to go back home, to go and re-Africanize Phokeng.
She's one of roughly 2.3 million small-scale farmers in South Africa, almost none of whom are able to compete in or with the commercial industry, a highly sophisticated sector that benefited greatly from the former apartheid regime at the expense of their subsistence counterparts. Despite her successes, Mama Kina has many of the problems all small-scale farmers inevitably face in the country.
There are a lot of challenges in farming. It's very sad that you have to come back home and lease land. First I got a 1-year lease, now I've got 5-year lease. I'm struggling to at least get 25-year lease. Who is going to invest in a land that you only have for 5 years?
Land ownership is an ongoing topic of much debate. The ANC government's reform programs aimed at paying out or returning land to dispossessed black South Africans have been widely criticized.
Under the constitutional negotiations, the households that lost their land under the 1913 Land Act, they could get their land back. Most of the previous owners don't want this land because they don't have the capital to work it, they don't have the skills to run agriculture. The very few who do take the land, most of them have been a total failure in agriculture.
While government has tried to focus on ensuring that previously dispossessed black South Africans who are applying for tenure are actually given land, little is being done to provide them with the services or the infrastructure that they need.
You hear horror stories from the new black emerging farmers about how they are given land and not support in terms of farming implements and so on, and capital. A lot of time being wasted. Instead of giving money to new farmers, they have to wait.
This is particularly hard on farmers who are trying to graduate from pure subsistence to small business.
And it's usually a very important dimension of small-scale agriculture is you first need to have volume, therefore you need to have production, and you need to have quality. Otherwise, market access per definition is closed.
For farmers like Mama Kina, harvesting enough produce that's the right quality for formal markets is still a distant dream.
We have 26 hectares and we're using 2.5 because of lack of resources. The money we had, my family, contributed, could just service 2.5 because farming is capital intensive, it's labor intensive, and to really lay out the farm for it to be ready, you really have to work.
Analysts have expressed concern over these inequalities between commercial and non-commercial farming.
We cannot continue with a dualistic system. It's unsustainable from a political perspective. From a stability perspective, we need to have a much more comprehensively integrated agricultural society.
Some are of the view that it's futile to try to incorporate small-scale farmers into the commercial market, and that it would make more sense to develop markets around them.
They are driven by self-sufficiency. They are not driven by profit because they operate in environments where the weather is not controlled. They don't have irrigation. They rely on rainfall water. They don't have access to most of these improved inputs. So if those are provided, if you come up with strategies to develop input and output markets within this rural sector, it is possible that you can revive it.
Whatever the policies that are put in place, in a country that has spent the last 100 years building a massive mining industry by forcing farmers into becoming labourers, those who are now living with that legacy have a common outlook.
Everybody was coming to Gauteng because there was gold. Gold is finished in Gauteng. We have dumps only. But land, it will always be there. Food will always be needed by the people. We need food security. And this government needs to invest a lot of money into farming, a lot of money into making people self-sufficient.
A lofty goal, and one involving major shifts in the country's current social, economic and development policies. But with 16 million of its citizens on social grants, millions starving, and one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, South Africa can't afford to leave its willing farmers in the dust. Diana Neal, Johannesburg.
Our reporter Diana Neal produced that story as part of a broader multimedia feature on this topic. Have a look at the coverage by logging on to www.enca.com. After the break, we'll discuss the state of South African farming with some top agricultural analysts right here on Africa 360, so do stay with us. Welcome back to Africa 360. This week we are unpacking the challenges facing South Africa's non-commercial agricultural sector. Joining me to help us understand this a little bit more in our studio is Dr. Michael Lalibert. He's an independent analyst. From our Cape Town studios is Professor Ruth Hall. She's from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies in Cape Town. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me start with you, Professor Hall. Why on earth is land tenure, land ownership in particular, such a hot topic here in South Africa?
Land is a political issue and is under pressure. We have a very small commercial farming sector with relatively few large companies that are seeming to get larger and larger. Most small-scale farmers are black farmers in the communal areas who don't have secure access to land. They don't have clear land rights, and they are very overcrowded. Often they need access to better quality land, land that's more strategically located, has better infrastructure. And I think that one of the critical issues now that needs to be resolved nearly 20 years after democracy is that people living in these areas live under forms of customary tenure, but the ultimate owner is the state, and their rights aren't clear. So we haven't actually conducted a tenure reform, a reform to clarify the rights of people who own that land by custom, but those rights are not recognized in law.
Let's bring in Dr. Lalibert here. What we need to look at doing is mainstreaming small-scale holders or subsistence farmers into commercial agriculture. Is this viable? Do you agree with this perspective?
There's a diversity of types of land needs. So there are, I would agree, the majority of people don't want to be mainstream. We shouldn't pretend that they are emerging farmers. Yep. We shouldn't hold them up to that model. They simply want land for tenure security and food security. Yeah. And our land reform program, quite sadly, doesn't cater to that need. It does cater largely to aspiring black commercial farmers, but it also misses that sort of middle category, what we call commercial smallholders. Those people that that typically are already practicing agriculture on a small scale for income purposes, and we believe that this is a sector that could grow in part through land reform. We want to grow this sector for its own sake. We don't want to necessarily assume that every smallholder is destined to become a large-scale commercial farmer.
So, Professor Hall, it then means that we need to look at other issues related not just to tenure, which would imply that we probably need to be looking at questions related to agrarian reform, making the agricultural sector more accessible to others, but more importantly, efficient in terms of the manner in which productivity occurs on this land.
We have found over the past 15 to 18 years of the land reform program that clearly transferring land by itself is not enough. And while we're doing this modest, slow land reform to redistribute access to land, overwhelmingly the changes in the agricultural sector have been towards consolidation and size. So in a sense, the land reform is at odds with our agricultural policy. It's an oddity of our land reform process that we buy whole commercial farms, then we transfer them to often groups of people who don't have a lot of capital behind them and develop business plans whereby they must replicate the forms of commercial agriculture that were already on that farm. This is often unfeasible.
Why isn't there an urgency and why isn't there a policy perspective to do the exact things that you recommend?
What we see, and in fact we've done some budget analysis to see who's getting the money from increased agricultural budgets, and what is clear is that while agricultural budgets might have tripled within the past decade and a bit, the actual bulk of the money is going to a very small number of projects, highly commercial projects, leaving the vast majority of black smallholder farmers with almost zero support. What has happened is that we have dismantled the bureaucratic and administrative and regulatory systems that supported and subsidized white agriculture. And at the same time, we're trying to transform black agriculture. So I think that what is helpful is the reintroduction of more forms of agricultural support. Some of that has been happening, but the budgets have been badly skewed towards the relatively few.
So a final question to you would be, do you really think agriculture can be relied upon to create entrepreneurs and indeed opportunities for jobs outside of large-scale commercial agriculture in South Africa?
The potential is there. If we figure out how to do things better, we can realize that potential, but we're just still scratching the surface.
So, Professor Hall, a final word for you. Are you as optimistic about the agricultural sector in South Africa, its potential to assist in poverty alleviation and indeed economic upliftment?
Absolutely. I think it has enormous potential, and I think that the focus, if we really want to grapple with that potential, is to focus on the people who are already farming and to help them to scale up, use the land they've got access to, improve their livelihoods, and be very wary of big, glitzy, capital-intensive projects. Rather give people access to the basics that they need to use their land, to use it well, to scale up, and importantly to access markets, because I think that a big irony in all of this is that some of the areas where most smallholder farmers are clustered, think about rural Eastern Cape, Limpopo, KwaZulu-Natal, in these areas they're competing with big supermarkets on their doorsteps in the rural towns. So I think that access into those markets is crucial, but I think that we can be spreading the available resources far better, so the potential is there to be tapped.
Well, certainly. Thank you so much for sharing those key insights with us. That was Dr. Michael Lalibert here joining me in studio. He's an independent analyst, and Professor Ruth Hall from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies. Do join me after the break, as I'll be joined by two more guests who will take our conversation on the state of agriculture a little bit further right here on Africa 360. Welcome back. You're watching Africa 360. The colonial and apartheid regimes left a long-lasting legacy, particularly for South Africa's rural community. The majority of the country was dispossessed of land 100 years ago this year. Joining me now in studio is Dr. Naudé Malan, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Johannesburg. And also joining us from our Pretoria studios is Professor Johan Kirsten. He is from the University of Pretoria. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on Africa 360. Professor Kirsten, let me start with you. It's often been pointed out that the plan of the current government in South Africa is to redistribute something of about 30% of the land back into black hands who were previously dispossessed. Is this an unrealistic target?
I think it's very important that redistribution needs to take place, and we therefore think it's a sensible thing to do. You see, the one thing is that you need to have land reform, but settling people on land cannot happen on its own, because you have this process of dispossession, and at the same time you had this process of lack of support services and lack of capacity building over the time. So we really need to have a process of empowerment, a process of actually engaging farmers with new skills, and therefore your support systems need to be in place.
Indeed, and I think it's a good place to bring in Dr. Nodia here. It's exactly those support services. Technically, they're referred to in the agricultural fraternity as extension services. Who provides these extension services, and is it done in a commercially viable way?
Often in South Africa, we have a great lack of enough extension officers.
Yep.
And you can imagine it's quite costly because they have to drive around rural areas of, large areas in the country. What you also have to realize is that smallholders or small farmers are scattered across the rural areas. They're difficult to organize. They speak different languages. They occupy different areas. For instance, the guys in Venda versus the guys in the Western Cape would have different interests, different crops.
Yeah.
So it's quite hard to bring them into the commercial fold, mainly because they also have very little land.
Yes.
So you can't have the economies of scale that a large farmer has. Now, there are other tendencies globally in agriculture that's pushing agriculture in all different kinds of directions. And there is this idea that smallholders could be more amenable to organic or permaculture kind of production methods. And that could be the case, but the point still is that if you want to be a farmer, you have to be as productive as you possibly can.
Professor Kirsten, it appears you wanted to join into our conversation here. Did you have an input?
Yes. The quarterly labour force survey suggests that we have 2.7 million people involved in agriculture, but 71% of them are unemployed. So they're basically in agriculture because it's the only activity that they have to survive.
Yep.
So that's the reality that we have to face in terms of the context of subsistence agriculture. It's the survivalist enterprises. So the challenge for us is how to move them from a survivalist enterprise into a commercial activity where they actually sell to the market.
South Africa is, in most parts, a semi-arid kind of environment or climate, which means that even agricultural production becomes difficult. Access to water. It's not all farms or subsistence farmers who can have access to these conditions that allow for productive agricultural practices.
You're absolutely right, because that is the reality of our climatic conditions, that we have one crop per year, whereas subsistence farming in Uganda and other places of Africa do have 2 to 3 crops. So on small pieces of land, they're able to really cultivate sufficiently. But now we have the opportunity to do more on irrigated land, and that's why the proposals of investment in dams and irrigation infrastructure could be a very important way to unlock the opportunities for these smaller scale farms.
Now, Dr. Nodia, one of the things that emerged as a result of this Native Land Act was the fact that there was a lot of segregation, not just in racial terms, but in real class terms, around black people being really relegated to the worst tracts of land. So it means, in my view, that an agricultural reform process would actually have to look at integrating communities into areas that allow for proper agricultural production.
I agree with you, but you have to also understand that the state is under severe pressure from different and contradictory sides. If we start meddling with those farms, established farms that are highly productive on highly productive land, and we change ownership too quickly with, like Professor Kirsten said, without the necessary support, we will start endangering the food security situation in the country. Food prices could go up, and they are already relatively high.
What if I put it to you that it's more than about food security?
We're always confused, you know, like Professor Kirsten suggested, that land equals agricultural reform, and it's not the same. Agricultural reform or agrarian reform is very complex. So we have to understand the inability of the state from a certain perspective, you know, why they could not accomplish large-scale change. But on the other hand, you know, we have to do this. And it is necessary in everyone's interest that we do change the patterns of ownership.
Well, Professor Johan Kirsten and Dr. Naudé Malan, we thank you so much for sharing those key insights into land reform and indeed agrarian reform in South Africa. Well, that brings us to the end of this edition of your program, Africa 360. Do remember to log on to www.enca.com for the full feature on this topic. If you would like to leave a comment or join the debate, you can also do this by finding us on Facebook. You can also follow us on Twitter or drop us an email on africa360@enca.com. And remember, you're more than welcome to suggest topics you'd like us to cover in upcoming editions of your program, Africa 360. So until next time, when we look forward to bringing you Africa like you've never seen it before, do take care.